Lord, we praise you. We thank you for allowing us to be here today. And as we go into your word, let it not return void. Let not a single word that we read today from your scriptures fall to the ground. But may they, like the words of the prophet Samuel, be planted in our hearts so that we will learn from them and we will obey them, God. And that we won't just puff ourselves up with knowledge, but that we will grow in godliness, grow in devotion, grow in desire for you, grow in compassion towards one another and care for one another, God. Let us be shaped by the studying of your word, and may your Spirit be present with us, guiding us into understanding as we do this. We love you, God, and we thank you for the intimacy that you have given to us. In your name we pray. Amen. All right. So today we have a mighty, mighty task ahead of us. For the last 6 weeks, we have been in the book of James, and that is because basically what we've kind of been doing with this whole Bible study thing is we've been going through the Old Testament. Really, we kind of started with the book of Judges, and that was a long time ago. And we basically have been going through the books of the Old Testament, but then we've been doing like small books in between, right? It just kind of worked out that after we did Judges, we had Ruth, so that was an Old Testament book. And then we went to 1 Samuel, and then in between 1 and 2 Samuel, remember what did we do? Colossians. Remember, we did Colossians. And then we went to 2 Samuel. And then in between 2 Samuel and 1 Kings, we did James. So next week we're going to start 1 Kings. But I was looking in my journals literally just a few minutes ago. Some of y'all were here while I was doing this. And I was wanting to figure out when it was that we started 1 Samuel. And that was on Tuesday, March 29th, 2022. Which, if you do the math, that's about a year and a half ago. So it has been a year and a half since we began 1 and 2 Samuel, and even longer since we started Judges, right? I mean, if you're including Judges, it's probably been 2.5 years, right? Or getting close to it, right? So we've been on this journey for a really long time, and I hope that we're remembering this stuff as we're going through it. But I think that sometimes it's also really helpful for us to just stop and recap things. And we kind of try to do this like just weekly. Usually we devote a pretty good chunk of our time to just covering context. But usually we get more and more focused on the stuff that is more relevant to the chapter that we're covering that week. But 1 and 2 Samuel is really just this amazing story. And so we spent a year and a half going through it. But what I want to do today is I actually want us to just spend the next 2-ish or so hours recapping the whole thing. Right? And so what we're going to do, we are going to flip our Bibles open, and we are just going to walk from 1 Samuel chapter 1 through 2 Samuel chapter 24. We are not going to go in depth. We are simply going to be covering the main points. But before we even do that, I am going to give us an even broader context of the entire story of the Bible. Right? And so kind of this is going to be a big picture version of what we do every week, to where I'm going to start with a very Spark Notes-ish version of the story from Genesis to Ruth, and then we will zoom in and go more in depth on 1 and 2 Samuel. Sound good?
Yes.
All right. So the way that the Bible begins, and I've got fancy little art pieces for all of this. The way the Bible begins is with God creating the heavens and the earth. Right? In 6 days, He creates everything. At the beginning, creation is formless and void, and so the first 3 days of creation, God gives the earth form, and in the second 3 days, He fills the void, right? So day 1, He creates light and darkness. Day 2, He separates the water, so there's the sea and the sky. Day 3, He brings forth the dry land. Days 4, 5, and 6, He fills those things, right? So if we start with light and darkness, well, now He puts the sun, the moon, and the stars in the heavens, right? Day 2, He made the waters and the sky. Well, when you get to day 5, He creates the sky creatures and the water creatures. Day 3, He created the dry land. So on day 6, He creates the animals. But He doesn't end there. In addition to creating animals, what God does is He creates man in His own image, and He basically gives man everything that He's created. Right? He gives him everything on earth, while the heavens continues to be His domain. Right? So God is the God of the heavens and the earth, but man has dominion over that earth. And so he is to be the image of God on earth, right? He is to be an imager, right? Somebody who literally does unto the earth what God has done to all creation, right? That is man's job. And then as you move further into the story, God places the first man into this garden paradise, right? This is a place that is known as Eden. The word Eden literally means paradise. And in this place, God creates for man the very first woman, and he gives them a very specific rule. First off, something we overlook oftentimes is that he gives them total freedom, right? Freedom to have whatever they want, do whatever they want in this garden, right? They can eat freely in this garden. The one rule that he gives them is that they cannot eat from this one particular tree in the garden. But there's actually two significant trees that we can talk about, right? In the very midst of this garden paradise, God has placed two trees. There's the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? The tree of life is the tree that you eat from in order to live forever, right? If you eat the fruit of this tree, it nourishes you and keeps you alive. And it just like makes you, I guess, super healthy, right? We don't know that much about it. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, though, that is something that man is not allowed to partake in, right? And God says, if you eat from the fruit of this tree, you will surely die. However, man does eat from the fruit of that tree. And therefore, God shows up and he basically curses two things. First off, he curses the serpent, which is the devil, who led man astray. And then he curses the ground as punishment, right? And from this moment going forward, we have this promise of future redemption and restoration, right? The serpent has been cursed, and therefore the devil will one day be crushed. And the way that he will be crushed is through the arrival of this future seed who will come from the woman to ultimately bruise the serpent's head, though the serpent will also bruise his heel, right? So there's this mutual destruction, right? But through this, redemption will come for man, and sin will be conquered. On the other hand, you have this promise of future restoration because the ground is cursed. And through the ground being cursed, we know that one day God will fix this, right? And so redemption and restoration go hand in hand. And now as we move forward from this Garden of Eden story, we basically are looking for the person who is going to show up and fix the problem, right? And so we fast forward, man and his wife are kicked out of the garden paradise, right? They are sent east of Eden, where they basically have to go make a family for themselves, and they have to learn how to live in a world separated from God and separated from the tree of life. And because they've been separated from God, they live in sin. And because they've been separated from the tree of life, they are doomed to die. And so they go out, they wander, they establish cities, but very quickly it becomes evident that man is not going to choose the pathway of good. He is not going to choose the pathway of godliness, right? Instead, man chooses the path of sin. And Adam and Eve's kids, there's two of them named Cain and Abel. Cain kills his brother. It's horrific, right? One generation away from Eden, and already we have a brother killing a brother. And it doesn't get much better in the generations to come. And so generations pass, and generations pass, and generations pass, and eventually it gets so bad on earth that God is sorry that he has created life. And what he decides to do is he sends a massive flood to wipe out the human population. But because he's gracious, and because he has a plan to redeem and restore all things, he saves Noah. And he tells this one man named Noah to gather together his family, to build a boat, and through this boat he preserves the line of Noah. However, the sin problem is not fixed. Noah is not the Messiah figure, though he is somebody through whom the Messiah will come. And so the story continues. Eventually the people continue in their rebellion. They build this huge tower because they are trying to be gods in their own right. And God says, all right, time to split these people up. And all of a sudden you have the formation of nations, right? And now the people are scattered throughout the world. Nations are being formed. And basically God realizes that in order to fulfill his purposes, he needs to choose one of these nations to fulfill the purpose that God had originally given to Adam, right? Man was created in God's image. They were supposed to be reflections of God on earth. Man chose the path of the serpent. And so now that there's all these nations, God chooses one man through whom he will produce a nation who will be imagers of God. And the way that God describes this man and his family is that they are going to be guardians of the way. They're going to be keepers of the way of Yahweh. Right? This man's name is Abraham. God gives Abraham a promise. He says, hey, Abraham, get up and go down to this land that I'm going to show you. And if you go down there, I will bless you. And I will give you a family. And through your family, all the nations of the world will be blessed. And so that's what Abraham does. He goes down to the land of Canaan. He never owns any of it except for one little lot of land. He owns the cave of Machpelah. And for decades he waits, but he never has a child. And then eventually he sleeps with another woman and produces a child, but that's not the child that God promised. Eventually, though, through enduring faith and through perseverance and through the faithfulness of God, Abraham does have a child named Isaac. And this is the promised child that God had promised to Abraham. But Isaac is still not the chosen figure that we're waiting on. And so the story continues. Isaac has a son named Jacob. And very quickly it becomes evident Jacob is not going to be the Messiah figure. Because Jacob is in no way, he's just not very messianic. This is a guy who is being conquered by sin more than he is conquering sin. Right? He is a deceiver. He loves deceiving people. He loves leading people astray. He literally begins his whole life by tricking. Right? He is known as a trickster. But God is faithful, and despite Jacob's rebellion, God manages to use Jacob for amazing things. And we have this amazing story near like the middle of Jacob's overall story, kind of reaching its end, where in the middle of the night, Jacob encounters a man who he wrestles throughout the entire night. And in the greatest of plot twists, turns out this man is God. And Jacob is stubborn, and he fights. And he fights the entire night through, and he's doing pretty good. And so God pops his hip out of socket. But he changes Jacob's name in that day. And he says, because you have fought against God and prevailed, your name will no longer be Jacob, it will be Israel, right? Which means to strive with God, right? And so Jacob's name is changed to Israel, and thus the nation of Israel is born. And these people are going to be the guardians of the way of Yahweh, the keepers of the way. Right? These are the ones who follow the way, they protect the way, they don't look left or right. They are supposed to be the imagers of God on earth. They are a holy nation. Right? Jacob has 12 sons. These 12 sons become the 12 tribes of Israel. But all is not good in the family. Right? Jacob had multiple wives. One wife he esteemed more highly than the rest. The firstborn of that wife becomes Jacob's favorite child. And that child's name is Joseph. Right? Jacob loves Joseph. Joseph is his favorite child. And as a result, the other brothers get very jealous. And so what they end up doing is they sell Joseph into slavery, where Joseph goes off into Egypt. But because God is faithful, he actually anticipated all of this. And so yes, Joseph goes off into Egypt, but Joseph actually went off into Egypt, yes, as a result of human evil, but ultimately because God had a purpose behind all of it. And despite all of Joseph's sufferings, despite all that happened, he ended up rising through the ranks of Egypt so that he became the second in command to Pharaoh, so that whenever Jacob and all of his sons back over in the land of Canaan faced this great famine, they could come to the land of Egypt. And Joseph, recognizing them, helped them. And he invited all of them to come and live with him in Egypt. And so you have this amazing picture of the future redemption and restoration. Right? So the way that Genesis ends, we're all still talking about just the first book. Don't worry. The rest of it's going to go a lot quicker. Genesis is just very foundational. Right? The way that the book of Genesis ends is with this beautiful portrait of what is one day to come. Joseph is in many ways a picture of the Messiah. Right? He is this redemptive person who takes this evil world and produces good from it. Right? He encounters this famine, yet he helps produce restoration by providing food in the midst of the famine. But Joseph isn't really even the main character of his story. There's actually this other character named Judah, who's one of Joseph's brothers, who starts off as a total scumbag, but ends up being this really great guy by the end. Right? And so that's how the book of Genesis ends. It ends with the people of Israel, which is just a small group of people at this point, living in the land of Egypt. When you flip to the book of Exodus, all of a sudden, hundreds of years have passed, and that small group of people has become a huge nation. Hello. That small group of people has become a huge nation, and they're living in the land of Egypt, but because they have grown so large so quickly, they have gotten a lot of attention for this, and Pharaoh decides to enslave them. Right? And so whenever we enter into the book of Exodus, the people of Israel are enslaved, and therefore what God does is he sends this guy named Moses to ultimately deliver them from the land. Just so you all know what we're doing, we're recapping 1st and 2nd Samuel in its entirety today. So I'm just like doing like a recap of everything to 1st and 2nd Samuel. So today's just a big context day. Yeah. And so God sends Moses to go deliver the people from slavery. And this is one of the most epic stories in all history. It is the most public event in which God has ever demonstrated himself. Because you literally have this one man showing up with his brother to deliver this whole nation of slaves from the most powerful nation at this time period through a series of miraculous events, culminating in them ultimately walking through parted waters, where literally the waters are stacked up side by side. Crazy story, right? But because God is faithful, he delivers them, and he takes them into the wilderness, where they arrive at a mountain called Sinai. And at this mountain, God decides to do even more theatrical things. He shows up on this mountain in a thick cloud of fire and lightning, and his presence descends on the mountain, and he basically makes a proposal to Israel. And when I say proposal, I mean marriage proposal, right? He basically says, hey, you see all that stuff that I just did for you back in Egypt? That was me trying to woo you, right? He says, that's what I will do for you, my bride, if you would become mine. And he says, I want to make a covenant with you. I'll be yours, you be mine. I'm going to give you this law. And if you follow this law, it will represent the union that we have together. And he makes this amazing proposal. And he announces these 10 commandments from the mountain where everybody can hear. And the people of Israel agree to the covenant, but at the same time they're terrified. And they're scared. And they're like, you know what? We will adhere to what you're saying, but we would rather not deal directly with you. We would rather Moses actually go up and down the mountain, and Moses can talk with you, and then he can tell us what you want to say, right? And so we have this crazy moment where God is seeking this super intimate relationship with people, yet they're the ones distancing themselves. So even in this redemptive story, you still have sin kind of leading people away. But Moses does this. He goes up the mountain, and he receives the law from God, right? This is what we would call the Torah. God makes a special covenant with them, kind of like the ones he made with like Abraham and Noah earlier on, but this covenant's conditional, right? It's not unconditional. This is a covenant that, as far like it just seems, it's a temporary thing between him and the people of Israel. And basically what he says is this: if you obey my law, when you get into the land I've promised you, things will go well with you. And if you disobey the law, when you get to the land I promised you, things are not going to go well, right? This isn't about salvation or anything. It is simply about them living in the land. And the reason why he does this is because these people, once again, are supposed to be the guardians of the way of Yahweh, right? They are the keepers of the way. And so all the nations are supposed to look at them in order to figure out how to relate to God. And so whenever they obey God, they prosper. And so everybody looks to them and is like, whoa, that's the God we should serve. But whenever they disobey, they get sent into captivity. And so the nations look at them and say, oh, we should probably serve Yahweh. So either way, whether Israel's being obedient or disobedient, God is getting the glory. And so they receive this law and they say, we are going to follow it and it's going to be great. And therefore, as a result, God comes to dwell with them in the tabernacle, right? They build this amazing tent with this golden box inside it called the Ark of the Covenant. God comes to dwell in their midst, and they begin to just wander in the wilderness. And slowly but surely they make their way towards the promised land. And they're about to go in and conquer it. But whenever they send some spies in there to seek it out, the spies come back terrified. And they say, you know what? Those guys in there are pretty big. We don't think that we can do this. And Moses is understandably upset because he's like, did you not see what God did with Egypt? You don't think he can handle these guys? But as punishment for their doubt, they're sentenced to wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. God basically says, all right, you don't think that I can handle this? Fine. Have fun dying in the wilderness. Your children will trust in me, and they'll be the ones who go in. And so, for 40 years, the people of Israel wander in the wilderness, not because they were lost, but because they were being punished, right? And so they stayed in the wilderness for 40 years. They died, and their children, they're the ones who are going to enter in, right? These are people who were but tiny little children whenever they were freed from Egypt. And so Moses also dies during this time period, right? Moses gets to live until the 40th year, and he dies with his eyes on the promised land. But he's not going to be the one to lead them in. And that's for a whole set of other reasons. Instead, the guy who's going to lead them in is a guy named Joshua. Don't look too closely at this image. These are all AI rendered images, and AI sometimes has tough times. If you're trying to figure out which way this guy is heading, good luck. But Joshua is going to be the guy that leads them in. Whenever you get to the book of Joshua, you'll see a lot of instructions to be strong and courageous. That's because this guy had a mighty task, right? He had been second in command to Moses for 40 years, and for those 40 years, he saw how unbearable these people were, right? These people would grumble and complain and just constantly rebel and lead active rebellions against Moses that would literally have to, the only way you could stop it is by God opening up the ground to swallow the people. Joshua saw all this happening. And now, Moses is dying, and Joshua is charged to lead these rebels and these stubborn, hard-hearted people into the promised land to basically wage war on all these people who are bigger and mightier than them. And you can see how that'd be a little bit intimidating. But Joshua does it. And Joshua is a valiant warrior. He's a valiant leader. He leads the people into the land, and they conquer it, right? They don't conquer all of it, but they conquer enough of it for people to say, this is now the land of Israel. It is no longer the land of Canaan. It is Israel's territory. And then over the course of the next few books, we're going to see more and more land being conquered, ultimately in 1 Kings, right? But Joshua leads them in, and at the very end of his book, he does the same thing with them that Moses did. And he basically says, hey guys, I'm about to die, and I leave y'all with a choice. Before I led y'all were in the wilderness. Now y'all have the land. Now it's up to you to decide who you're going to serve now that you're in the land. As for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. Right? He says, and if you're not going to serve the Lord, get out. Right? This land is for the people of Yahweh. And these people are going to be a holy people who are set apart for his glory. And so only stay here if you're going to follow his rules. Because if you don't follow his rules, it's going to be bad for everybody. And the book of Joshua ends with this amazing moment where everybody says, amen, hallelujah, we are going to follow God's law. And then you flip to the book of Judges. They don't do it. Right? This is where Morgan Freeman's voice comes over the loudspeaker and says, they did not. Because they didn't do it. Right? Very quickly in the book of Judges, you realize that these people are not going to obey God. And so when you get to the book of Judges, you enter into this time period of Israel's history where they are basically going in and out of oppression. Which is exactly what God said. He said, if you disobey my law, I will subjugate you. Right? And eventually I'll kick you out of the land. He didn't do that in Judges, but it got awfully close. And so if you kind of were just putting the book of Judges into a line graph on a, a XY axis, basically it would just be just going downhill and then a slight uphill, but then further downhill, then slightly uphill, then further downhill, to where ultimately by the end of Judges, you are in the negatives. The way the book of Judges ends is with the people of Israel doing something that even the people of Sodom and Gomorrah wouldn't do. There's an intentional story that is directly calling back to Sodom and Gomorrah. And keep in mind, Sodom and Gomorrah, those are pagans who do not know the law of God. The people of Israel have the law of God, and they are doing worse things. That's not a good sign. But throughout this time period, God sends multiple heroes, known as judges, to come and save the day. Right? You got people like Gideon, Samson, Deborah, Jephthah, Ehud. Right? Ehud's the guy who stabbed the fat king. There's some really cool stories in here. Whenever I'm going through the book of Judges with my students, I can guarantee you that the junior hires are going to love that book. Because it's the stuff if you're a little boy, you're oh, that's awesome. But it's really a tragic story, right? Because you literally get to see the entire nation of Israel just falling apart. And that's ultimately where we started this whole study about 2.5 years ago, right? We were in the book of Judges, and the reason I wanted to go through that is because I think that it isn't too far to find the comparisons between the book of Judges and the church, right? What we saw physically happening in the book of Judges is, I think, what we kind of see spiritually happening in the modern day church nowadays, where we don't take God's commands very seriously, And as a result, we are tolerating more and more sinful practices. And ultimately, I think in many churches you can say there was no king in the church. Everybody was doing what was right in their own eyes. And so that's kind of how we started that whole journey, right? Going through the book of Judges, and basically there's just bloodshed on all sides, to where even the good guys at the end of the book of Judges aren't even good guys, right? They're just better than the bad guys, which is sad. But then you get to the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth is set during the time period of Judges, and it's really encouraging because it shows us that things aren't always as bleak as it may seem. The book of Ruth is just a short 4-chapter story that in the Jewish Bible, it's not even located here. It's actually located way later. But it is set during the time period of the Judges. And it's basically a story that sets up the story of David, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Ruth is a Moabite, right? She is not an Israelite. But through a set of circumstances, she comes to dwell in the land of Israel with her mother-in-law, Naomi. And basically, it's just the story of her being this amazing, faithful woman who ends up becoming an Israelite through marriage to Boaz. And through that, she becomes the great-grandmother of David. It's just a really beautiful story. But ironically, the hero of that story is not a Jewish person. It is a Gentile, Ruth. And so we have a Gentile coming to the faith, and she is actually seen as super faithful. Even though Boaz, he is an Israelite, he's a really cool guy. Right? And so the book of Ruth, great story. We covered that one as well together. But all of that being said, this is the context that directly leads us into the book of Samuel. And before we actually start walking through it, what I wanted to do is just briefly recap just like the overall structure of it, and then we're going to zoom in and actually start walking through it play by play. Sound good? All right, so general structure of Samuel is that whenever you open up to 1 Samuel, the first 12 chapters are primarily focused on this dude named Samuel, who is the final judge of Israel. Right? We talked about how you had the whole period of the judges. You have people like Gideon, Samson, Deborah, Ehud. And really, these guys are a mixed bag. Right? Some of them are decent, like Ehud and Othniel. Those are great guys. Deborah, she's pretty great. You get to people like Jephthah and Samson, not great. Right? Whenever you get to those guys, you're like, wow, it's just amazing that God can do anything through people as vile as them. Right? But Samuel, he's a great guy. Right? He's got some issues, but ultimately highly positive, right? So that's how the book begins. But then you go from chapter 12, and then chapters 13 through 31 primarily focus on the reign of King Saul. I'm not going to say that that is what the chapters are primarily focused on, because in many ways, these chapters are also focused on the rise of a guy named David. But it is set during the time period of King Saul, who we can describe as man's king. Right? The people of Israel are going to ask for a king to be like the nations, and God gives them a king like the nations. But then, because God is faithful, he ends up giving them another king, and this is what the book of 2 Samuel is all about. It is about David, who is God's king. And so, if you're just looking at the broad overview of 1 and 2 Samuel, that's what it is. It's Samuel, Saul, David. But to put it another way, you can actually look at it like this, right? There's an overlap between all of these, right? To where really chapters 1 through 7 are really focused on Samuel. But then when you get to chapters 8 through 15, it's like this transition period, right? Where Samuel is still the one in charge, but the people begin asking for a king. And then you have Saul being put in charge, which then leads to chapter 16 to 31, where Saul's in charge. But even though Saul's in charge, you have David beginning to rise up. Right? And so it's not just a clear, okay, let's talk about Samuel, Saul, David. Instead, it's actually a lot of crossover to where Saul is that story right there, right? You have a few chapters seeing Saul rise up, and then a bunch of chapters seeing Saul crash down. And then same thing with David, right? You start with David, and he rises up, and then halfway through 2 Samuel, he also has this downward spiral at the end. But then chapters 21 through 24 of 2 Samuel, at the very end, it's basically this nice little epilogue. Right? There's 6 different epilogues that kind of just wrap the whole story into a nice little bow to just kind of finish all the different narrative elements that were placed throughout the whole thing. And so that is just a kind of big picture look at 1 and 2 Samuel. Now that I've taught for so long, are y'all ready to actually walk through both of these books in a little over an hour? Yes? All right, cool. Let's flip to 1 Samuel chapter 1, and let's begin to recap 1 Samuel. I will put just the structure of it up here. Whenever you go to 1 Samuel, you got chapters 1 through 12 being the last judge, chapters 13 through 31, Saul, the first king. Let's start off with chapters 1 through 3. We start off with this person named Hannah and her request. How does 1 Samuel open up? Somebody start walking me through it. And just remember to talk loud so that people can hear on the microphone.
There's a person named Hannah, and she's barren, but she really wants a child. And so she goes and she prays to God asking for a child, and God gives a child to her, and his name is Samuel. Yes.
To go a little bit more, so that's what the story is, right? There's this woman named Hannah. She's barren. She's like the second wife of this guy. And the other wife just has all these kids. But she's desperately wanting a child. And so she goes in to pray to God. And there's a priest there at this time. What's his name? Eli. Yes. And what does Eli think of Hannah?
That she's drunk.
He thinks she's drunk. Which probably isn't a very good sign whenever somebody comes to the house of the Lord and is praying fervently. And the priest's first inclination is to think, oh, she must be drunk. It probably suggests that there's not many fervent prayers going on at this time period. Despite the fact that this is the time period of the judges, where it seems like this would be the best time period for some fervent prayers. But apparently, Hannah was an exception, right? She was actually just an exceptional woman. And so she's crying out to God, and Eli shows up, and then what ends up happening? What promise does she make to God?
I was just going to say, if you give me a son, she's asking God, if you give me a son, I will give him back to you.
Yeah. It's actually a very interesting thing, because she's saying she doesn't want the son simply to have him for herself, right? It's not a greedy request. She's saying, God, I just want to have this child, and I'll give him back to you, right? Because ultimately what you've given is yours. And so she isn't wanting this just to be greedy and to show off, oh, look, I've got a kid. It's just a genuine thing that she wants. She wants to be a mother. And so she asks God, please give me this son. And God answers that request. She has the kid, and you already said it. What's the kid's name? Samuel, right? That's why this book is called 1 Samuel, right? Despite the fact that Samuel dies like part of the way through 1 Samuel, he's the one who's it's named after, right? And so chapter 1 ends with basically the birth of Samuel, and then ultimately Hannah's talking, and she says, for this young boy I prayed, and Yahweh has given me my petition which I have asked of him. So I have also dedicated him to Yahweh. As long as he lives, he is dedicated to Yahweh. And yeah, so Samuel's born, right? That's what chapter 1 is all about. It's all about the birth story of Samuel. But then you go into 1 Samuel chapter 2, and what do we get?
Hannah's prayer.
Hannah's prayer. Now, what is this prayer all about?
She's praising God, like singing a song of praise to him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, praising him specifically for what?
Well, it seems like it might be like more than one thing. Like it seems like it might stem from Samuel, but there's also kind of like prophetic things that kind of go on to where it seems like it also is beyond just God giving her Samuel as a child.
Yeah. No, for sure. Like, so it seems like Samuel's birth really just confirmed to her certain truths about God's general character, right? And so she's basically sent into this like prophetic frenzy where she just sings this amazing song that sets up the whole book, right? Like, and I'm talking about 1st and 2nd Samuel, because you got to remember, like, from a Jewish perspective, 1st and 2nd Samuel are one book, right? We separate them just because it's a nice little division between like basically before David was king and now that David's king, right? That's kind of how we separate it. But originally they're just one book. And the whole story is bookended with a song, right? So you have Hannah's song at the beginning, and then you have David's song at the end, and then you also have a song at the split between 1st and 2nd Samuel as well. But Hannah's song is literally just praising God and saying like, God, you are amazing. Like, you can take people who are at their lowest and you can exalt them. And you can take people who are at their highest and you can humble them. And she's just reflecting on the character of God, which ultimately leads her to prophesying this amazing thing. If you go to verse 10 of chapter 2. Those who contend with Yahweh will be dismayed. Against them he will thunder in the heavens. Yahweh will render justice to the ends of the earth. And he will give strength to his king. And he will exalt the horn of his anointed. Right? The word anointed there is the Hebrew word Mashiach. Right? He will exalt the horn of his Messiah. This is really interesting because she refers to a king and she refers to a Messiah. Despite the fact that neither of those exist in Israel at this time period. It's almost like she is prophetically anticipating that this story is heading somewhere. And it's the same place that I kind of set up way back in Genesis. Right? That ultimately there was going to be this one figure who would show up to crush the serpent and crush and basically remove the curse from the world. Right? Redemption and restoration. It's ultimately coming. And in the background of every Israelite's mind, this is the story. Right? They are still waiting for this person to show up. It was really at the forefront in Genesis, but now once you get into 1 Samuel, it starts coming back to the forefront. Right? Because really, the promise of this king was really tied to the land. Now that they're dwelling in the land, they're beginning to focus on this again. Right? And so they're there, and she's saying, if God can do this for me, what else will God do for his people? He will exalt his king. He will exalt the horn of his anointed. The horn represents power. Right? If he will take a humble woman like me and give me a child, how much more will he do for his king, for his anointed one? Pretty cool. And sure enough, it sets up the rest of the book. And so as you go into the back half of chapter 2, what do we see?
We see Eli's sons.
Yeah, are they good or bad?
They're not very good because they're eating
Not good.
parts of like the sacrifice that they're not supposed to.
Yes. Yeah, so Eli's sons are not good, right? Eli, once again, being the priest. And this just sets up a theme that's going to be prevalent throughout the whole book of 1 and 2 Samuel of bad fathers, right? There are not really any good father figures in the entire books of 1 and 2 Samuel, which is really sad. But Eli, his sons, they're terrible. And Eli doesn't really seem to handle it well. Right, like the way that Eli does it, like he doesn't really get onto them. He's more just like, guys, stop it. But like he doesn't discipline them. Right? He's like, oh, boys will be boys. Like Eli seems like he's one of those guys where people kind of joke around like a person who's so heavenly minded that they're no earthly good. It's kind of like that. Like Eli puts everything in spiritual terms, but it seems like he's just doing that, right? He's putting everything in religious terms, but he's not living out the religious principles that go along with that.
It's like empty words.
Yeah, it's empty words, right? And I'm not saying he didn't believe it. I'm not saying he wasn't convicted of it. I'm just saying there was an inconsistency with him. And so we see that there's a problem here, right? Not only is the nation corrupted, but even the priesthood's corrupted, which is not good because these are the people who are supposed to be the guardians of the way of Yahweh. And you're like, y'all aren't guarding it very well, right? And so as we continue through this, we see that Eli he doesn't reprove his sons as he should. Which then leads to chapter 3. Because if you're not picking up on it so far, you realize Israel needs a new leader. Right? Israel needs somebody who will lead them back to God. Which is exactly what we're introduced to in chapter 3. What happens?
God calls Samuel. He's sleeping in the temple, and God calls Samuel, and he thinks it's Eli, and he does this 3 times.
Yeah, so Samuel's just a little boy, right? Hannah, in fulfillment of her promise, she gave Samuel back to Eli, right? And so basically they're growing up over in like the Shiloh region. There's no temple yet, but there's the tabernacle, right? And so, Samuel's just growing up there, and one day in the middle of the night, he hears, Samuel! And like any of us, he doesn't immediately assume that he is receiving a divine message from the heavens. He's like, Eli, what do you want? And Eli's like, I didn't call you. But then it happens again. And Eli's like, dude, I didn't call you. Stop messing with me. And then Samuel's like, no, this voice keeps calling me. What do you want? And Eli says, I think this is God. And it seems like Eli realizes something's going on here. Okay. Next time that the voice calls you, simply say, Hineni, here I am. Your servant is listening. So that's what Samuel does. And God has some stuff to say to Samuel. What does God say to him?
He talks about like Eli's sons and about how like they're going to be cursed, and that Samuel is going to become.
Yeah, basically God makes some promises that aren't very good for Eli. Right? He says, hey, Eli has allowed his sons to be very corrupt, and as punishment, Eli's house is going to be cursed. And they're going to die very soon. And Eli, like the next day, Eli's like, so, what did God tell you? And Samuel's like, well, that's an awkward conversation. But he tells him, right? And so basically there's this prophecy that Eli's house will be cursed and that things are going to go poorly for them. And then at the end of chapter 3, we read, thus Samuel grew, and Yahweh was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. I think that's one of the most beautiful verses in the world. Right? I think that's what we should pray for ourselves as Christians, that none of our words would fall to the ground. That we would, when we would speak, we would say words that communicate truth and that are meaningful, and that we're not just wasting words, but that the words we say go into people's ears and don't fall to the ground. Right? I just think that's really cool. So all Israel from Dan even to Beersheba, from south to north, or north to south, from Dan to Beersheba, knew that Samuel was confirmed as a prophet of Yahweh. And Yahweh appeared again at Shiloh because Yahweh revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of Yahweh. And so, what we see here, sorry, I was trying to look for something. What we see here is that Samuel grows up. And very quickly, people realize that there's something special about this kid. He is a prophet, right? And it's been a long time since they've had a prophet, right? They've had judges, but a prophet, that's pretty cool. There's also some parallels that I feel like it'd be bad of me to not address them. Hannah's song, very similar to Mary's song that she sings in the Gospel of Luke, right? Whenever Mary encounters Elizabeth and she sings this song with John the Baptist sleeping in the stomach and stuff, the song is very similar, right? Luke is very clearly alluding back to this. But then it also says Samuel grew and Yahweh was with him and let none of his words fall to the ground. Very similar to in that same chapter in the Gospel of Luke where he says Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man. Luke very clearly seems to be associating Jesus with this story right here. And I think the reason why is clear, right? Because Jesus is a prophet, but he's also going to be the king that Samuel ultimately leads to, right? The book of Samuel leads to the rise of David, and Jesus is the greater David, right? So just little details like that are important to notice, because whenever you're reading the New Testament, you can understand what's being communicated, but if you understand the Old Testament stuff, you're like, oh, I see what's going on, right? It's like Luke's making a very clear allusion, and you're like, oh, got it. Yeah. All right, and so that's chapters 1 through 3. It's all about Hannah's request and the fulfillment of that request. But then we move on to chapters 4 through 7, which specifically focus on Israel versus the Philistines. First off, who are the Philistines?
Enemies of God.
Enemies of God. These are some people who historically have been known as the Sea Peoples. Philistine literally just means invader, right? It's actually where we get the word Palestine nowadays, right? Palestine comes from the word Philistine. It was actually a derogatory term that people gave to the name of Israel to kind of spit in the face of Jewish people, right? They said, oh, look, it's the Palestine, like it's the Palestinian land now, right? The enemies of God have, like that's why they named it that, right? But Philistines, these are the people who, they basically came from the sea and just started trying to conquer land, right? And so if you think about it, Israel and the Philistines aren't too different. Right? Israel, they came from the wilderness to conquer the land of Canaan, and the Philistines are doing the same thing. The difference is that Israelites believe that God has given them this land. Who knows? Maybe the Philistines thought the same thing. In many ways, it's a competition between gods. Right? Whose is the more powerful God? which is kind of what we see in chapters 4 through 7. So what do we see in chapter 4?
The Ark of God gets captured in chapter 4.
How does it happen?
The Israelites and the Philistines, they go out to fight, and Israel is like starting to lose because they don't really like trusting in God that much. And so they're like, oh, if we're not winning, maybe it's because like we don't have the ark with us. So they're like, let's go back and get the ark. And if we take that into battle, that will help us win.
Yep.
And whenever that happens, the Philistines are able to like take the ark with them and kind of mock Israel.
Yeah. So basically what the people of Israel do is they start kind of treating the Ark of the Covenant as if it's like a magic totem. Right? In many ways, they start treating it like an idol. Whereas you have to realize, the Ark of the Covenant, it housed the presence of God. Like, God did come to dwell in this in some weird, mysterious way. But it's not the same as an idol. Right? Because whenever they had an idol, they viewed the idol as their God. Well, that's how the Israelites are treating it here. Right? They go off into battle, they lose the battle, and they say, oh, well, maybe if only we had the Ark of the Covenant with us, we could win. Here's the issue. According to the law, what is the key to winning battles?
Trusting in God.
Trusting in God. Right? You don't need, like, it doesn't matter where the Ark of the Covenant's at. The Ark of the Covenant could be in Timbuktu. The Ark of the Covenant, like, you want it near to you because it's the presence of God, but it's not its proximity that determines whether or not you win the battle. It's your faithfulness in Yahweh that determines whether or not you're winning the battle. And so as soon as they lost the battle, they should have realized, oh, crud, we probably need to repent. But they didn't do that. Instead, they started trying to use God in order to achieve their own goals. Right? And so they grabbed the Ark of the Covenant and they said, let's bring it in there. And this is Eli's sons going with them. Right? And what happens? What happens to the Ark?
It was captured.
Captured by the Philistines. What happens to Eli's sons?
Killed.
They're killed. Right? And what happens in the battle overall?
Philistines win.
Philistines win. Right? So, you cut back to the home base. Eli is sitting at the gate, waiting for the news of what's happened in the battle, and the people return. And it's this very dramatic moment, right? To where it's very Hebrew in how it's, I mean, obviously it's written in Hebrew, but it's very Hebrew in how the message is delivered. They say, Eli, we have news. And he says, what's the news? And they say, Israel has lost the battle. And moreover, your sons have been killed. And moreover, the Ark of the Covenant of God has been captured. And we don't know how Eli responded to the first two things. You would think that his sons being killed would have been like the worst thing there. Because ultimately the Ark of the Covenant being captured, it's bad, but like they did it to themselves, and also like God can handle himself, as we're going to see. But Eli doesn't really respond to the death of his sons that much. Instead, when he hears the Ark of the Covenant of God has been captured, it says that he was so terrified and in shock that he fell backwards. And because he was a very fat man, he landed on his head and broke his neck. And he died. And so, in one day, you have Eli and two of his sons dying. And then the chapter ends with his daughter-in-law, Phinehas' wife, right? So one of the sons that was killed, that guy's wife, she gives birth to a son on that day, and names the son what? Ichabod. What does Ichabod mean?
The glory has departed from Israel.
The glory has departed, right? And then I believe she dies, right?
Yeah.
It was taken. So she died. She dies giving birth to this child, but before she dies, she names him Ichabod, saying the glory has departed. And so what we see is that the family of Eli, as God promised, is being cursed. But there's still a remnant left, right? We go into chapter 5, what do we see?
The ark's like in front of the pagan gods of like the Philistines, and those like statues keep on like falling in front of the Ark of the Covenant, and like day after day they like go and they like put the statue back up, and every time they come in it's like falling down in front of it.
Yeah, it's actually kind of like a comedic break in the story. to where you basically just get like this like little montage of like the Ark of the Covenant like being transported from like one temple to another in the Philistine territory, because everywhere they bring it, like the gods keep like falling over and like breaking, and then like tumors are breaking out on the people. They're like, what the heck's going on? This is weird. And it's just kind of funny, unless you're a Philistine. If you're a Philistine, this is terrifying, because one, you just thought that you defeated the God of Israel, but turns out he doesn't even need an army. Turns off he was just playing games, right? You were playing checkers and he was playing chess, and you like got him and you're like, ha ha ha, we got him. And like, no, he doesn't need an army. Like, he is literally just like working his way back home on his own. And so they're terrified. You get into chapter 6, what happens?
Israel gets back the ark.
Yeah, but how's it happen?
It came back on from a mule, or from like an animal, and the animal was talking. God was making the animal.
Well, no animal talking here. That's a different story. That's the book of Numbers.
Son of the donkey.
Yes. But you are correct. Basically, the Philistines are like, we need this ark out of the way. Like, because this thing is just, like, it's killing our gods, and it's killing us. So they literally just take the Ark of the Covenant, they put it on a cart, and they just, like, spank the ox and say, go wherever. And then literally, there's just, like, some Israelites just wandering through the field. And they just look up. And, like just think about this. The Ark of the Covenant has been gone for 7 months at this time. Right? It's been gone for 7 months. They've been despairing over the fact that they're never going to see this again. This is God's presence. And then, like, there's these dudes just, like, walking through a field. And they look up. And there's, like, just some cows just, like, dragging the Ark of the Covenant back in. It's a really funny story, but it just shows God doesn't need an army. Right? Which is something that, like, that's a consistent testimony of the whole Old Testament, right? You don't, like, the size of your army doesn't matter. Even in the book of Judges. Remember, like, Gideon? Like, he's like, we're going to fight the Moabites or the Midianites. And God's like, your army's too big. And Gideon's like, and keep in mind, Gideon was like a coward at the beginning of the story. He's like, too big? You sure? And he's like, make it smaller. So they make it smaller. And God's like, nah, still too big. So it gets down to 300 people. And then none of them even have to fight. Like, all they have to do is like break some pots and like smash some stuff. And then like everyone's like, ah! And then like they kill each other. And it's fine. Right? And so God doesn't need an army. I was reading this today in Deuteronomy chapter 31. Moses is like, guys, I'm about to die. Right? I am not going with you into the promised land, and I can see by your faces that y'all are terrified. But God's going to be with you. Joshua's going to be with you too, but that doesn't matter. Because Joshua's he's just another me. Right? You don't need a Moses. You don't need a Joshua. All you need is Yahweh. If he's with you, you don't even need an army. Right? Instead, it's a privilege to serve in the army of God. Right? It's just an opportunity to join him in what he's inviting us to do. It's kind of like, you know, what we do as Christians, right? God doesn't need us to accomplish his purposes. He invites us to, right? He wants us to join him, but he can do it on his own, right? If he wanted for the entire world to be saved, he could just snap his fingers, right? But instead, he wants us to go out and do this stuff, right? And so he doesn't need an army, right? He can he can destroy the Philistines on their own without even that battle taking place. He can bring the Ark of the Covenant back home. Like, this is like the first Uber driver, right? Like, the Ark of the Covenant has an Uber of its own, right? It's wild. And so, that leads us into chapter 8. You would think after this whole thing that the people of Israel would be like, wow, God is amazing. If anybody deserved to be our king, it would be him. But that's not the lesson they learned, is it? Chapter 8, what do they ask?
Ask for a king.
They want a king.
Specifically like the nations. Ugh, so stupid. Right? And this is something that Moses anticipated. You read Deuteronomy, and he tells the people, hey, God's supposed to be your king, but inevitably, you're going to ask for a king. And you're specifically going to ask for a king because all the nations have a king. And you're going to want one. That's because of your hardness of heart. And Moses explains that God will allow them to have a king. But there's certain rules the king must follow, and he should be a holy king. Right? So if you're going to try to be like the nations, at least your leader has to be holy. Right? Like, God's just very gracious. He says, okay, originally, all of mankind was supposed to be my image bearers. Israel, I'll be satisfied if y'all hold up, y'all bear the burden there. And then it's like, okay, well, originally all of Israel was supposed to be the burden bearers, but at the very least, the king. Like, it's like God is so gracious. And so he says, okay, if you're going to appoint a king, he's got to be godly. Right? So the people of Israel, they come to Samuel. And Samuel, keep in mind, he has been leading, like in chapter 7, he leads this massive revival, right? He leads everybody back to God. It's amazing. It's encouraging. And you're thinking, wow, they're going to be focused on God forever now. And then Morgan Freeman says, they were not, right? Like they don't do it. And literally there's this massive revival in chapter 7, chapter 8. They're like, so anyways, we were thinking about different ways to get our minds off God again. And we were thinking it'd be great if we had a king so we could be like the nations. How does Samuel respond?
He wasn't very happy.
He wasn't happy. Why?
Because God was supposed to be the king.
Kind of, but what else did Samuel feel?
He also felt kind of rejected by them just because he's kind of led them for so long and he's done so much for them that they just kind of like threw him off. As if he was nothing.
Yeah, I mean, Samuel's been a faithful leader, right? He's been a prophet this whole time, leading them. Not a single one of his words falling to the ground. He led them back to God. He has helped Israel become Israel again, right? They've become holy. They've gotten back on track. And then just as they've reached this moment of like actually doing what God wanted them to do, they're like, hey, so can we have another leader? And Samuel's like, what the heck, guys? Like, I'm right here. At least let me die first. But he takes the question to God, and what does God say?
They haven't rejected you, they rejected me.
Yeah, God says, Samuel, stop focusing on yourself. It's not you they've rejected me. That's the problem, right? But God says, I'll give them a king. I will give them a king just like the nations. And so, verse 22, chapter 8, then Yahweh said to Samuel, listen to their voice and appoint them a king. So Samuel said to the men of Israel, go every man to his city. You go into chapter 9, what happens?
Saul's appointed as king.
Saul's appointed as king. Where do we first encounter Saul?
Looking for donkeys.
Running around looking for donkeys.
His father's donkeys, to be exact.
Yep, his father's donkeys have gone missing, and Saul is just running around. It's once again supposed to be funny, right? I mean, there's definitely like the guy who wrote Samuel knew what he was doing. There are many ways that he could have started off Saul's story. He chose to have him running around looking for donkeys, not having any idea of what he's doing. And then eventually they happen to be strolling through Samuel's area, and he's like, hey, isn't there like a prophet or something over here? Maybe we should go ask him what's up. The idea is that Saul is not a very spiritually minded guy. He also might not be even the brightest guy. He's just going around looking for some donkeys. He's like, hey, I think there's like a wizard down the road. Maybe we could ask him where the donkeys are. That's kind of how it's portrayed, right? And Saul strolls up, and Samuel sees him, and Samuel's like, oh, crud. This is the guy. Saul is a head taller than everybody else. He's tall, dark, and handsome. He is the picture-perfect image of a worldly king, right? He's got the looks of a celebrity. He's got the mind of a celebrity. He's got the worldview and values of a celebrity. It's exactly what you'd want in a king. So, Saul ends up being anointed as king. Him and Samuel hang out for a little bit. The next day, Saul starts going back home, and he starts prophesying. And all of a sudden, people are like, oh my gosh, is Saul also among the prophets? They're so confused, because they're like, we have never seen this dude have a religious bone in his body. And now he's like running around like prophesying. What's up with that? Like, hang out with a wizard for a day, and I guess that stuff happens, right? And so everybody's like just totally confused about this, and that's moving into chapter 10 now. And as we continue through chapter 10, we actually get another coronation moment for Saul, right? What happens? All the people of Israel gather together.
And Samuel starts basically whittling down like the people to kind of reveal who the new king is going to be. He calls like different tribes forward, and eventually he calls like Saul's family, and he's like, okay, there's Saul, and then like Saul's not there, and he's like, where's Saul at? Like, he's just king, we don't know where he's at, and he's like hiding off in the baggage because he's scared.
Yeah, it's very theatrical, right? You've got all the people of Israel gathered together. All right, will the tribe of Benjamin please step up? Okay, tribe of Benjamin steps up. Everybody else sits down. All right, will the son of Kish please, or the family of Kish please step forward? All right, Kish steps forward. Like, everybody's excited. All right, will Saul please step forward? Everybody's like looking around. And it's not like this guy's hard to see. He's a head taller than everybody else. He's tall. He's handsome. Everybody would see this guy. And he's hiding in the luggage. Right? Because he's terrified. Once again, the author knows what he's doing. He is not, like, he's intentionally, like, that's a detail he could have skipped. right? He could have just, like, if this were David, it would have just been like, they went and looked for David and found him. But he's like, nah, homeboy was hiding in the luggage, right? He's like, this is embarrassing, right? So Saul is appointed as king, and immediately he just takes charge and starts leading the people, right? No, not quite. Where do we see him next?
He like goes back home and he's just kind of like chilling in the fields.
Yeah, he's just going around chilling in the fields.
Not knowing what to do because
Yeah.
there's never been a king before, and so no one's really told him like, here's what you need to do.
Yeah. Yeah, like, and that's the thing about Saul. You have to realize, like, we need to be gracious towards him. He is doing something that's kind of unprecedented. He is serving as king over a nation that already has a king, right? Like, God is king. Like it really is kind of confusing for Saul. Like, what is my job, right? Because typically the king is the lawgiver and the judge, and the king. But they already have a lawgiver and judge and king, right? It's God, and so Saul's kind of figuring like, so what do I do? And he doesn't really know what to do, and so he ends up just becoming the definition of worldliness, right? So he goes back home, and he's just like working the fields, and then one day some people stroll up, they're like, did you hear what the Ammonites did to our people? And Saul's like, this is unacceptable. So what does he do?
He threatens people.
Yeah, he threatens people to get an army together. I will say this, Saul is he's got leadership qualities, let's say that. I'm not going to say he's a good leader. He knows how to get a group together through intimidation. What he does is he cuts up an ox into 12 pieces, ships it throughout the land, and says, if you don't come fight in my army, I'll do this to your oxes. Safe to say, everybody comes and joins the army. Which this ties in with what Samuel warned the people. Samuel warned the people, if you appoint a king over you, the king is going to take. He's going to take your land. He's going to take your food. He's going to take your children and send them off to war. He's going to take your daughters and make them his wives. He's going to take everything. And by appointing this king, you're going to end up destitute. And this is all because you wanted to be like the nations. And so Saul's a picture-perfect example of that, right? He's appointed king in chapter 10. In chapter 11, he goes off. He has this amazing battle where he goes and he wins, and everybody's like, whoa, Saul is awesome. He is great. And they totally overlook the fact that the only reason he even had an army to begin with is because he scared them. Not good, right? And so they're really excited about having a king, but they don't even realize what they've given up, right? They have given up their freedom. You go into chapter 12, and Samuel just talks to the people, and he basically says, hey, here's the deal. You got a king now, and he's going to take, right? He says, all the things I just said. He's going to take your land. He's going to take your families. He's going to take your children, your daughters. He's going to take your money. He's going to tax you. And God is witness against you. That you asked for this, God did not command it. So all the negative things that flow from having a king, that's not on God. That's on you. And so if you ever come to regret this, don't you dare turn against God. Because he did not command this. You did. Which then leads us into King Saul's rejection. Did not last very long, did it? You have like one good chapter for King Saul, and even then it's only like a slightly good chapter. What do we see in chapter 13? I realize we're going to have to move a little bit quicker. Because, what do we see in chapter 13?
Saul's first failure.
His first failure, right? There's really two primary failures we're going to see. But what happens in this first one?
Isn't that where God told Saul to utterly wipe out the Amalekites? Or was that something
I believe that's chapter 15, right? Yes. Chapter 13, basically, Saul is going to fight against the Philistines. And Samuel was supposed to show up to offer sacrifice. But he shows up a little bit late. Right? Probably because he was a busy dude. I don't know. Maybe he was testing Saul. I have no idea. He shows up, and when he shows up, Saul's offering the sacrifice. The issue is that Saul's not a priest. He's not from the tribe of Levi. Those are the people who offer sacrifices. Well, that's kind of a problem. Because now we see that Saul's power is going to his head. Right? Because now, because it's ambiguous what a king does, he's decided, I'll do whatever I want. I can be a priest. Why not? And Samuel says, dude, that's my job. And Saul's like, you were late. What could I do? The people forced me. Right? I mean, I honestly had no choice. I had to give God a sacrifice. I didn't want to go into battle without worshiping God. And how does Samuel respond?
He says he's not gonna be king. His kingdom is gonna be torn away,
Yeah, I'm trying to find the exact verse. Yeah.
taken away.
And Samuel said to Saul, this is verse 13, "You have acted foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of Yahweh your God, which he commanded you. For now Yahweh would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not endure. Yahweh has sought out for himself a man after his own heart. And Yahweh has appointed him as ruler over his people because you have not kept what Yahweh commanded you." That's interesting. He says that if Saul had not been disobedient, God would have established his kingdom forever. Which is weird because way back in Genesis, God promised that ultimately Israel's king would come through the line of Judah. So it almost would suggest that way back in Genesis, God knew that Saul was going to be disobedient right here. Right? Because we knew, well, he's from the tribe of Benjamin. He's not going to be the one. But Samuel says that you could have been. But God knew that you were going to do this. And so he's already picked somebody else. Like, think about what a slap in the face that is. Right? It's not even like, oh, you got another chance. Like, Saul messed up, and Samuel said, yeah, God basically knew you were going to fail. So he's already picked somebody else. Yikes. Right? Imagine you had a job like that. You were picked for a job. You messed up, and you hear that the boss knew you were going to mess up, and they already had a replacement for you. Doesn't say much about you, does it? It's like, wow. And you would think that right here Saul would just repent and get his act together, but he doesn't. Instead, what he's going to do is he's going to push back. In chapter 14, we actually get this amazing story about Saul's son Jonathan being a surprisingly amazing guy, despite the fact that his dad's terrible. And Jonathan actually goes and single-handedly basically just destroys the Philistines. It's actually a really cool story. There's one point where he kills 40 people in the span of he kills 20 people in the span of 50 yards or something like that.
Going uphill.
Yeah, going uphill. Just think about this. It's he's just running. It's it's literally him and his armor bearer.
Yeah.
2 people just taking people out left and right. It's out of it's like John Wick in real life. It's crazy. And ultimately Saul punishes Jonathan for this because Jonathan was acting unintentionally in disobedience to a stupid rule that Saul put in place. Because Saul was just trying to be cool. I don't know. You get to chapter 15, and Saul disobeys again. What does he do this time?
He goes to fight. I forget who he goes to fight. The Amalekites.
The Amalekites.
Yeah, and he's supposed to go and wipe out everything, children, women, the livestock, everything, and he wipes out a whole bunch of people, but he also keeps some livestock, and he keeps King Agag.
Yes.
And so he doesn't kill him like he was supposed to. And so Samuel gets really mad at him. I think Samuel ends up killing him.
Yeah, he does.
Himself,
Yeah, Samuel
because
gets in. He gets his hands dirty here.
He gets really mad because he was you had one job, was to go and wipe out all the Amalekites, but you still took stuff for yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, so, and you have to realize that there's also, first off, God commanded it right here for him to destroy the Amalekites. So that disobedience is already bad enough. But there's also a greater historical aspect to this too, where way back with Moses and stuff, God promised that because there are certain things that the Amalekites did to the people of Israel, they were the first ones to oppose Israel whenever they escaped Egypt.
Yeah.
And God said, because the Amalekites did this, they're going to be destroyed. You are going to wipe them out off the face of the planet. And so Saul isn't just opposing that. He is opposing this multiple generation long promise God has made. Right? And he spares Agag purely to show off. Right? If you totally wipe him out, you don't have anybody to show off. But if you take their king and bind him and walk him through the streets, now everybody knows how awesome you are. And so he left Agag alive. Right? And he kept a lot of the animals alive. And of course, Samuel shows up and says, "Didn't God say to destroy everything?" Saul's like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Why do I hear the sound of sheep and goats?" And Saul's like, "Huh." And you can tell that he's just trying to he's like, "Oh crud, I wasn't expecting to get caught." He's like, "Well, here's the deal. We decided to keep some of the sheep and goats because we wanted to offer them as a sacrifice to God. And we knew we couldn't do that because remember last time, Now, I know I can't offer the sacrifice, but we kept them so that we could worship God and thank Him for what He'd done. And how does Samuel respond?
To obey is better than to sacrifice.
Hine Shema Misebach Tob. Behold, to hear is better than to sacrifice. He's like, I am not happy right now. He says God doesn't want empty religious action. He doesn't give a crud about your sacrifices. He wants you to listen to Him. If He says wipe them out, He means wipe them out. And so that's exactly what Samuel does. It's actually very poetic. Where's it at? Let's see. No, I'm looking for where he kills Agag.
Starting in verse 32.
Ah, there it is. Then Samuel said, bring Agag near to me, the king of the Amalekites. And Agag came to him in chains, and Agag said, surely the bitterness of death has departed. So Agag's brought before Samuel, and Agag's like, all right, looks like I'm not going to die today. And Samuel says, as your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women. And Samuel hacked Agag to pieces before Yahweh at Gilgal. Old man Samuel was like, whoosh, whoosh. Smash, smash, smash. But there's this dark humor behind this, right? Because what Samuel says here is a poem, right? As your sword has made women childless, so your mother shall be childless among women. Okay, so there's a parallel, right? You have sword, woman, childless, mother, so woman, childless, and then the question is, like if you're Agag here, you're listening to it. So as your sword has made women childless, so your mother will be childless among women. And Agag's like, wait, where's the sword at? And Samuel's like, right here. It's really dark, right? But yeah, so Samuel fully obeys God, which reminds you maybe he should have been the leader, right? Meanwhile, Saul, he says, no, please don't. I know I messed up, but please just like take me before the people and exalt me, right? Just don't let the people know that I screwed up. And as Samuel goes to turn away, Saul grabs him by his robe and it rips. And keep in mind, this is the robe that Samuel's mother gave him. Does not make Samuel happy. Samuel turns around and says, just as you have ripped my robe, so God has ripped the kingdom from your hands. And it says that Samuel and Saul never saw each other again until the days of their death. Right? Well, at least until Samuel died.
And
Saul will get one more encounter.
And that God regretted putting Samuel as king over
Saul.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Saul, sorry.
Yeah, God regretted putting Saul as king. But the good thing is, once again, God already picked a replacement, which leads us into chapters 16 and 17, the rise of David. I've mentioned how Samuel was really upset at Saul. I don't want you to interpret that as meaning that Samuel disliked Saul. Samuel was hesitant about having a king, but once God chose, Samuel was all in, and he really liked Saul. Like, he loved him. Despite all his flaws, Samuel loved Saul, and he was torn up by it. Chapter 16 opens up, and basically God says, Samuel, I get it. You're mad. You're sad. You're still torn up about Saul. Suck it up and move on. Because I've picked another king, and it's time for you to go anoint him. And so where does he go? He goes to the little town of Bethlehem. Bethlehem, the house of bread. He goes there, and he goes to, like, basically everybody in the town's terrified because everybody's heard that, like, Samuel and Saul are not on good terms. And if Samuel shows up, they're like, all right, do you come in peace? Or, like, what's going on here? And Samuel basically shows up to the house of a guy named Jesse, and he says, all right, God told me that, one of your sons is going to be king. It's like, wait. And as soon as you hear that as Jesse, you're like, oh, what? Because basically what Samuel, like, to translate, Samuel is saying, I'm inviting you into a treasonous conspiracy. Because there's already a king in Israel, right? And typically the next king would be his son. And he's already got a son. And now Samuel shows up over here. Everybody knows that Samuel and Saul are not on good terms. And Samuel says, hey, one of your sons is going to be the king. And it's like, I'm assuming we're not telling anybody about this, right? So it's very hush-hush. But Jesse gets all of his sons together, lines them up. And Samuel sees one. He's like, now that guy, he's tall, dark, and handsome. But I don't think that's him. That's weird. Okay, let's get the next guy up here. Oh, no, next one. And he's getting confused because he goes he goes down the whole line of guys, and none of them are the guy. He's like, now I'm confused because I know that it's one of your kids, and none of these are the kids. I'm just going to take a shot in the dark here. Is there a chance that there's like another kid you're just not telling me about? And this is where probably Jesse begins to blush. He's like, well, crud. Now this is a turn of events. And he says, yeah, I've got one other kid. He's a shepherd. He's the youngest. He's not king material. And Samuel says, go and get him. Enter David. David shows up, and as soon as Samuel sees him, he just like pulls out the horn of oil, anoints him, and says, you're going to be the future king. And then, because God is faithful, and because God has a plan behind all of this, around the same time that David is made anointed king, the Spirit of God departs from Saul. And instead, Saul begins to go into fitful rages to where people are freaking out. And they realize that they need somebody to help Saul out. And lo and behold, just a few miles away from where Saul set up, there's this really young boy who's a shepherd who also just happens to be like the best music player in the entire region. And everybody's like, hey, maybe we should go get him. And so, David, the shepherd boy, is not only anointed by God, but he ends up in the palace of King Saul, ministering before him and playing music to soothe him. It's almost like God has a hand behind all of this. Then we flip to chapter 17. And this is David's claim to fame. What happens?
Story of David and Goliath.
The story of David and Goliath. Israelites and the Philistines go to battle once again. This time the Philistines have a trick up their sleeve. They send out this giant into the front. And he says, hey guys, here's the deal. We don't like bloodshed. You don't like bloodshed. We'll just make this a one-man versus one-man fight. Mano y mano. Right? Winner take all. Right? You send me out your best champion. I'll fight him. If we lose, we're your slaves. If you lose, you're our slaves. Let's make this nice and easy. The issue? Goliath's 10 feet tall. And he was raised as a warrior from his youth. This is not a dude to be messed with. And if anybody was to fight him, who would you think would stand the best chance?
Saul.
Probably Saul, because he is the tallest man in Israel. Right? He is the king. If anybody was to defend the name of Yahweh, it should be Saul. Right? They're king. And plus, we all know that God doesn't even need an army, right? God could defeat Goliath on his own if he wanted. But that's not how Saul responds. Saul's terrified. And usually the people are going to be no better than their king. And so the people are terrified too. But you know what the people don't realize? They actually have another king who is happening to show up to deliver cheese to his brothers. 40 days have passed. David strolls up. He's just been sent on an errand. And he's like, hey, bro, I got cheese. And he shows up and he happens to overhear Goliath defying the nations of Israel. And David, just a teenager at this time, he's like, hold up. How long has this guy been doing this? And like you can just imagine the glare that this little teenage boy is giving all these like muscly warriors. He's like, he's blaspheming God. And you're tolerating it? He says, this won't do. He's like, I'll fight him. I'll do it. And they're like, David, you're a kid. You have no armor. You're a shepherd. Just give us your cheese and go home. And he says, no, I'll do it. Like, God has, I've killed lions and bears with my bare hands. And they're like, you did what? Oh, crud. And he says, well, it wasn't me. It was God through me. And like, yeah, I've done that stuff. And they're like, oh, shoot. Okay. And Saul's like, well, at least let me give you my armor. And he's like, I don't need armor. I just need God. So he goes out there, he picks up 5 stones, he only needs one of them. And he literally gets into like some smack talk with Goliath. Goliath's like, oh, you're just a kid. I deserve more than this. Come on, this is the best you got? And David's like, all right, dude, here's how this is going to go down. You come to me with like swords. That's cute. I have the God of creation on my side. So here's how this is going to happen. You're going to come at me. I'm going to come at you. I'm going to kill you with this stone right here. I'm going to chop off your head. And then your body is going to be food for the animals. And the same is going to be true for your armies. That sound good? And Goliath's like, who's this kid thinks he is? And then 10 seconds later, David proves that he was telling the truth. Goliath dies. David chops off his head. And all of a sudden, David is a superstar. He is on the cover of like all Teen Bop magazines in Israel. All the guys want to be him. All the girls want to be with him. Everybody's like just going crazy about David. And that leads us to David in King Saul's courts, now no longer merely as a harpist, but now as a celebrity warrior harpist. Like this dude, he's like everything, right? And he's got that emotional side. He's got that like rugged side. He's, he takes care of sheep, so he knows how to take care of it. Like he's basically just like the dream guy for like anybody, right? It's like literally every guy was like, yes, this is, this is what we all aspire to be. And then all the girls are like, that's the type of man I'm looking for, right? This is who David is right here. We go into chapters 18 and 19. What do we see?
David forms a friendship with Jonathan.
Yeah, he very quickly becomes best friends with Saul's son, Jonathan. They make a covenant with one another, basically just being like, hey, are we best friends now? Like, let's be bros forever. Like, and they're like, yeah, that sounds awesome. And like they start like just making these plans of like Jonathan very quickly picks up on the fact that David is going to be the future king. Like, and Jonathan's not even jealous. Jonathan's like, you know what, man? That's cool. I'll be your second in command. It'll be great. And they have like this kind of, like, Jonathan's much older than David, but they still kind of have this like childlike fantasy that some way they can both be in charge together, where David's in the lead and Jonathan's there. And then it's only over time that they begin to realize that that's not going to happen, right? That Jonathan, like, there's no way that this would happen with Jonathan still alive. But Jonathan isn't the only one that David gets close to. Who else?
Was it Saul's daughter?
Yeah, Saul's daughter. One of them, like, Saul tries to, like, set up David with one of the daughters, but David's like, no, who am I to marry the son, to marry the daughter of a king? I'm just a little boy from Bethlehem. And then he looked at Saul's younger daughter. He was like, all right, wait, hold up. Now okay, look, we can talk about that girl. He sees Michal, and he's like, whoa, hubba hubba. What do I have to do to marry her? I feel kind of bad for the other girls. Like, she's like, what the heck? But Saul, at this point, he's jealous, right? He sees, like, first off, he's received a promise that God has chosen a man after his own heart. David's checking off all the marks, right? People are singing songs about how Saul's killed his thousands, David's his tens of thousands, and David's just like some teeny bopper who just showed up out of nowhere who just plays a harp. Saul he's mad. He's like, this is dumb. David is receiving all the praise that Saul always wanted. And David's not even striving for it. And so Saul says, you know what? If you want to marry my daughter, go kill 100 Philistines. David kills 200. And Saul's like, that did not go as planned. Like, he was planning on David like going and like being outmatched. And David's like, nah, I guess I had a good day. Here you go. So he marries Saul's daughter, but the bitterness continues to grow to where eventually, chapter 19, Saul starts chucking spears at David several times. But in addition to being a teenage heartthrob and epic warrior, musician, shepherd, Saul, like literally, he's everything, right? He's like the original Renaissance man. In addition to being all that, David's also a ninja, and he can move at super speed. And so, like, Saul throws a spear, and David, he dodges twice. And he doesn't even quit his job. You know, if my boss started, like, trying to actively murder me, I'd probably say, hey, you know what? I quit. But David doesn't do that. He's just like, it's all right. King Saul's going to do what he's going to do. And he's just, like, confidently just, like, still playing music for him. But David escapes. And eventually, Saul gets so mad that he has David surrounded by mercenaries. And Michal basically pulls a Ferris Bueller, you've always seen those movies, where like somebody puts like a fake person in the bed and acts like they're asleep. That's what Michal does for David, right? Michal just like covers it up. He's like, oh, David's feeling sick, and really David escaped out the window and he fled, right? And so that leads us to David being on the run from Saul. And we can go through this one a lot more quickly because I know we need to get to 2 Samuel. But in general, what happens in chapters 20 through 27?
First off,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, first of all, Jonathan figures out that his father Saul's trying to kill him, and they're forming a plan of how he's going to get him to safety.
Yeah. Yeah, so there is this thing where basically, once again, Jonathan and David, they're really trying to make this work out, right? And Jonathan's like, okay, let me figure out how mad my dad really is. And then it turns out, oh yeah, he's really mad. Like, you need to flee. You need to get out of here. But they reestablish their covenant. And basically, Jonathan says, hey, if God forbid something happens to me, take care of my family, right? And you kind of get this idea that they realize there's no way that like if Jonathan survived, there's no way that would go well, right? And so it's almost like Jonathan begins to realize that he's not going to make it out of this alive. And so they make a promise and they say, hey, if something happens to one of us, the other one will take care of the family, right? And so David flees, and chapters 21 through 27, just to summarize it very quickly, this is where I would say that David went through his Robin Hood phase, where basically he flees into the wilderness. He's now a homeless dude, and during this time period, for a short time period, he's really lonely and by himself. We actually see that in the Psalms more than we do here. But he goes to this cave of Adullam, and in this cave he writes this psalm where he's just talking about like how alone he is. But then people start coming to him, and the people who start coming to him are all the afflicted and lowly in society, kind of like the people who come to Jesus, right? And these people are people who have been done wrong by King Saul, and they say, we would rather live with David in the wilderness than to keep serving Saul. And they basically realize that David's going to be the future king, right? And so what David does is he takes these this ragamuffin group of just like random misfits, and he trains them into an elite fighting force. It is awesome. like they become known as the Gibborim, the mighty men, right? And these people basically, they become like Robin Hood and his merry men. Like they literally just spend the next few years like going around helping people out, right? And they will oh, you need a bodyguard? All right, I'll be your bodyguard. And they're going around doing all this. Hey, Mom. They go around doing all of this while also running for their lives from King Saul, right? And so it's really cool. Like David, he's not really that concerned with becoming king. It's like God made him this promise, and he's like, yeah, God will do it in his time. What he's primarily focused on is serving God's people. And so he does that. And then there's several times, and once again, I'm just summarizing this so that we can get to 2 Samuel, because it's, we went more in depth. But there's several times where God, where David's on the run, and Saul comes so close to David, to where David could easily kill him, right? And David's men encourage him to. But David says, no, I will not do this, right? I will not touch the Lord's Mashiach, his anointed one. And so he spares him. And in those times, David does confront Saul and say, hey, dude, I cut off a piece of your garment just to show you I could have killed you. And Saul's like, oh my gosh, David, I'm so sorry, man. Like, I was only trying to kill you because I thought that you were trying to, steal my throne. That's my bad. I get that I'm wrong. Come back home. And David's like, thank you for the apology, but I think you'll understand if I don't come home immediately because I don't entirely trust you. And then sure enough, Saul turns on him again, right? And so really chapters 20 through 27 is literally David as a fugitive on the run from Saul, but actively engaging and helping people out and doing all this different stuff. The one negative side to this is that during this time period, David does also start acquiring some more wives. Mainly, I mention that because we're going to see that there is one vice that David has that, he's got too much riz, I guess we could say, right? Yeah. He's a little bit too good with the ladies, and no surprise. I mean, come on, he's David. I don't think we should be surprised that all the women want to be with him, but he probably should not have gone with that. And basically, at the end of chapter 27, what David ends up doing, he actually seems to have a little bit of a lapse in faith, and he actually escapes to go dwell with the Philistines, which is really ironic, because his claim to fame was by killing a Philistine, But now he's welcomed into, like, basically, like, this is really good for the Philistines, right? If you think about it, it's like this guy is most popular for killing one of us, but now his kingdom is turned against him to such a degree that he has fled to join us. And so from a Philistine perspective, this is like really good, like, propaganda against Saul, right? Saul is so bad that David the giant slayer came to dwell with the people who produced the giant, right? That's pretty crazy. But then we get to chapters 28 through 31, which is where King Saul dies. What do we see happen in chapter 28?
Saul goes to a medium at Endor, at a place called Endor, to try to talk to Samuel about being in touch with God.
Yeah. So basically what happens is Saul has been so consumed with chasing after David that he has let his entire kingdom fall apart. Right? To such a degree that at this point in the story, the Philistines have captured almost the entire land. Right? They have captured Bethlehem. They have captured everything to where now we're up in like almost the Galilee region. Right? Like way north. Like this is crazy how much he's given up just because he's been so consumed by chasing David. And Saul begins to realize that there's this big battle coming up, and it's not looking good for him. Because he's been so focused on chasing David, he hasn't made the preparations. And so finally, at long last, Saul gets on his knees and tries to talk to God. Right? He inquires of God. We talked about how the word for inquire in Hebrew is Shaul. It's the same as the name for Saul. Right? And the irony is that David is always Shauling of God. He's always inquiring of God. God, where do you want me to go? What do you want me to do? Saul never does. Until this moment. In chapter 28, he's desperate. He finally inquires of God. Shaul finally Shauls of God. But God doesn't answer. Because it's too little too late. Right? Like, dude, you've been actively chasing down the new king. I'm not answering you. And so in one desperate attempt, Saul actually goes into enemy territory. And he tracks down a witch, a medium. Right? Which is expressly forbidden in the Torah. And he says, I want to talk to Samuel. He's treating Samuel in the same way that the people of Israel treated the Ark of the Covenant. Right? I need to talk to Samuel. I need to know what's going on. And so miraculously, I don't know how it worked, Samuel shows up. Right? Like the ghost of Samuel literally just shows up. And he's ticked. He's like, what do you want? You bothered me enough during my life. Can't you just let me be happy now that I'm dead? Oh yeah, by the way, I forgot to mention Samuel died earlier. Right? Like that happened. We didn't mention it. It happened. It happened while David was on the run. Right? And so Samuel's like, okay, if you're going to bother me, I'll just tell you what's going to happen. You're going to be joining me soon. So I was like, oh, crud. Not what I was looking for. But sure enough, that's what happens. Right? In chapters 29 and 30, we actually cut back to David. And we get to see that the Philistines are going to march against Saul. But since David is with them, they begin to realize, you know what? David's a pretty smart dude. Like, if he was wanting to get back on Saul's side, the smartest thing he could do is, like, infiltrate us, act like he's one of us, and then in the middle of the battle, turn on us. So they're like, maybe David sits this battle out. And so they send David away, and David ends up having to fight his own battle on his own to save his people and another thing. But it's really nice, because that way David doesn't have to fight against Saul, because we don't know how that would go. Like, we know that Saul, he wouldn't do it. It makes you wonder, he probably would have turned on him. I have no idea. But that does lead to chapter 31, where ultimately the battle happens, and the Philistines kill King Saul. And not only Saul, but his sons as well, including Jonathan. And so all of them die on the same day, and then in a real tragic event, they cut off their heads. And then they go hang their bodies in a city called Bet Shean. But then, just at the very end of that section, we actually have this really beautiful ending where the people who Saul saved at the beginning of his career, right, way back in chapter 11, whenever he cut the ox into 12 pieces and sent it throughout the land, he did that because he was going to save these certain people. Well, those people remember what Saul did for them. And so in the middle of the night, they sneak into Philistine territory and they take the bodies down and they go give them proper burial. And so it's just kind of a nice little ending to that. And so there's 1 Samuel, right? We spend a lot of time on that. We are not going to have that much time for 2 Samuel. but it's hard because there's so much good stuff. Like, it's such a good story. Like, you want to spend more time on it. What's that?
It's dense.
Yeah, it's dense. Yes, like we spent so much time on that, and that was with me like breezing through some of the most exciting chapters in 20 through 27. Like 20 through 27's got some good stuff. But for the sake of time, since it is 8:55 and technically we're supposed to end in 5 minutes, we're going to go a little over, just so you know. Let's go into 2 Samuel. So when you get to 2 Samuel, the general structure is chapters 1 through 10 we can describe as David's triumphs. And then chapters 11 through 20 is David's troubles. And then chapters 21 through 24 is just an appendix. Right? So let's start off with David's triumphs, which doesn't really start off super triumphant because in chapter 1, David learns of the death of Saul. How does he respond?
He does not like it because the guy who came down and he was covered in, he looked kind of homeless, and David was telling him like, how do you know Saul and Jonathan were killed? And the guy gives him an explanation, but because he's saying that he killed them, David doesn't like that because you're not supposed to touch the Lord's anointed, and he has him executed.
Yeah. So basically, it's exactly that. Where, so the way that Saul died is that he fell on his sword, right? This guy shows up to David, and you can see that he's probably got an agenda here, right? From everybody else's perspective, David has been on the run from Saul for years now, probably a decade, and you would probably think that if a dude's been chasing you down for a decade, you'd be happy that he's dead, right? If it was anybody other than David, that would be a fair assumption, right? If I was in that situation, I'd probably be kind of happy. But David's built different, right? He is a different guy. He is a man after God's own heart. And so he did not wish anything harmful on Saul. He knew that probably inevitably this had to happen because he knows that God eventually was going to make him king. But he's not happy that Saul's dead. But that guy doesn't know this. That guy shows up and he's like, hey, David, King Saul's dead, and guess what? I killed him. And this dude, obviously, he's wanting a raise, right? He's like, hey, you're going to be the king now. Just remember who helped you out, who put you on the throne. And David says, you did what? And he has the guy killed. He's like, no, we don't do that here. That's not how my kingdom works. So right off the bat, David says, we will not tolerate anybody touching the Lord's anointed. I don't care if that guy tried to kill me for 10 years. There's a reason why he did it. Because multiple times I could have killed him, but I feared God too much. You don't fear God enough, so you're going to die. Very bold move to establish things. But then David backs that up by singing a song. And in that song, he mourns the death of Saul and Jonathan. And he praises Saul. And he says, there's never been a man like Saul. What an amazing man. Like, if you want, like David should be the guy to officiate your funeral, is what I'm saying. Right? Because we hear more praises of Saul in 2 Samuel chapter 1 than we actually see in all of 1 Samuel. Right? Whenever we look at 1 Samuel, Saul seems like just a terrible dude left like all the way through. But from David's perspective, he has nothing but respect for Saul. Which is wild because this is a dude who tried to kill him for like 10 years. But David's built different, right? That's just how he is. And so he cries and he mourns and he's like, oh, Saul's dead? And they're like, but that means you're king. And he's like, but Saul's dead? He's like, guys, this is not cool. Like, he's the Lord's anointed one. He's great. That's so sad. But then, moving on from that, we do move into some more positive stuff. Chapters 2 through 6, David's kingdom is established. At long last, David becomes king. First off, in chapter 2, where does he become king of? Judah. Right, so there seems to be a kind of divide right now, which is going to continue into 1 Kings, so keep in mind this. The area of Judah is the southern region of Israel, and then the rest of it is like the northern kingdom, which would be the other like really 10 tribes. Judah is like composed of really 2 tribes. It's like Judah and Benjamin. And then the rest of it's 10 tribes. And the southern kingdom really seems to support David, whereas the northern kingdoms really seem to support Saul. Right? Well, the southern kingdom, as soon as Saul's dead, they're like, hey, dude, you want to be our king? I mean, you're from our tribe. You should be our king. And so they appoint him as their king. And then there is basically Saul has like a bastard son named Ishbosheth, and he is appointed as king over Israel because he's literally like the last remaining dude from Saul's family, right? And so they're like, I guess we have no option. Like, if we want Saul's dynasty to continue, I guess it's Ishbosheth. And it is Saul's commander, Abner, who puts him in charge. But ultimately, what happens in that whole story?
Like a civil war breaks out between David's side and Saul's side because they try and like make this dumb competition where they try and like do like a funny thing, like while they're like sitting at like this pool of water or whatever, and it turns into this like actual fight. And
Yeah.
people start killing brothers, and then people start getting mad, so then they go to attack other people, and most people start dying, and commanders and all this stuff.
Yeah, it's kind of like that scene in Anchorman. You ever seen Anchorman? Where you're like,
It's actually-
wow, that escalated quickly. That got real out of hand real fast.
Yeah.
Somebody got killed with a trident. That's basically what happens here. We're literally like, they're just like chilling at a pool, and it's like David's guys are over here, Saul's guys are over here. Like the house of David and Saul, right? And there's like, they have like this friendly competition, which very quickly turns unfriendly, and it just turns out like a whole civil war to where everybody's getting killed left and right. And then like Joab, who is David's commander, one of his brothers gets killed, and Joab's like, I'm gonna remember that. And like, it's like just like this whole thing, and then finally like they're chasing everybody down, and finally somebody's like, guys, let's just stop. Like, can we stop with the bloodshed? And they're like, okay, that's fine. And then they just go home. It's weird. The idea is that it shows that David's in charge, but the house of Saul isn't yet done, right? There's still some things that need to be taken care of. And so we get into chapter 3, and it just so happens that Ishbosheth isn't really the greatest king, right? And Abner, Saul's former commander, he realizes this, and so he actually defects to David's side. And he says, hey, so David, I'm sorry for opposing you for all those years with Saul and with Ishbosheth. That's my bad. Can we be friends? And David being David, how does he respond? Absolutely, man. You know what? Sure, come on in. Welcome to the party. But do you know who Abner recently killed in the previous chapter?
Yeah.
Asahel.
Yeah, he killed Asahel, Joab's brother. Joab, he is David's nephew and David's commander over his army. He is going to be a thorn in David's side. Because Joab, you don't mess with Joab, right? So Abner in the previous chapter killed Joab's brother. And so David's like, Abner, you know what? Let bygones be bygones. Come on to the party. And Joab's like, hey, Abner, can I go talk to you over in this dark alleyway real quick? No, it's nothing sketchy. I just want to talk to you real quick. And then stab, stab, stab. Abner's dead. And Joab's like, well, David, I mean, like, come on. That was obviously a trick. Like, okay. Like, which really, if Abner had survived, that would have probably been the best way to easily, like, just put David in charge over everything. Because Abner was really the one in charge, not Ishbosheth. But then you go into chapter 4, and what happens?
Ishbosheth dies.
Ishbosheth also dies. Who kills him?
Isn't one of them?
His own people. That's what I'm trying to get at. His own people kill him, right? His own people are like, yeah, we don't like this guy, and they go kill him too. And so Ishbosheth is also dead, which now means that the house of Saul is officially just like done, right? Yeah, there's like this one, like Jonathan had a son named Mephibosheth. We're going to talk about him a little bit. He's still alive, but there's nobody to be a king. And so what ends up happening?
David becomes king.
Yeah. So whenever you get to chapter 5, everybody comes to David. They're like, hey, so Abner's dead. Ishbosheth is dead. And we've heard that you're pretty dope. How about you just become king of like all of us? And so 7 years have passed at this point, right? Like, so David was king over Judah for 7 years. And then he becomes king over all of Israel. And that's going to be for another 33 years. So all in all, David's going to have like a 40-year long reign. And he becomes king when he's 30 years old, right? And so, chapter 5, David becomes king over all Israel. And then he immediately begins to... what is the very first thing he does?
He moves the ark.
Not yet. Still chapter 5. Very important in the grand scheme of things. It gets like less than half a chapter. It's very important.
He defeats the Philistines?
Before that.
He has the people who killed Ishbosheth that executed.
No, what he does is this. He says, we need a new capital city. Right? Because Saul had been situated in this one place and stuff. David wants a city that is directly in the center of Judah and Israel. Right? So it's like it unites them. And it's this really important city that's currently called Jebus at the time, because the Jebusites lived there. And David says, that's a nice city. I like that city. We're going to conquer that city. We're going to make it our capital. He captures the city. He renames it Jerusalem. Right? And so up until this time period, the people of Israel did not conquer, like they did not have Jerusalem. David, the first act of business as king, he's like, we need a new capital. Jerusalem's going to be that capital. And he establishes it to unite the two people together. And very quickly, that's where he builds his palace and everything. And then, like a king, he starts taking in some more wives. That'll come to bite him in the butt a little bit. And then he does go war against the Philistines. And what does he do against them? Does he win or lose? Win, right? He's David. Come on, of course he wins. Yes, David goes out and he wins the battle against the Philistines. Basically what we're seeing is we're getting a vignette of just like David's early reign. And the idea is that he's doing what a king is supposed to do. Right? He establishes a capital that is beneficial for the people and which will glorify God. He destroys the Philistines, which Saul never did, right? By the end of Saul's reign, the Philistines have basically conquered the whole land. David shows up and just immediately is like, boom, 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 get out of here. Right? And he's just winning. Then you get to chapter 6. One of my favorite chapters. What does David do after that? Now that he's got Jerusalem, what's he need to do?
Move the ark.
He says, we need to get the Ark of the Covenant and move it here. You know when the Ark of the Covenant was never mentioned? During the reign of Saul. Saul didn't care. David, he's king now, and he says, if this is our capital, it's not just going to be a political capital. It's a religious capital too. Because my kingdom is God's kingdom. And so if the king dwells here, then the king dwells right next door. Right? And so that's what he does. So he says, go get the Ark of the Covenant. We are bringing it in. And it's so cool. David is so in love with God that as they bring the Ark of the Covenant in, he is dancing half naked through the streets of Jerusalem, leading this whole congregation, to where his wife, at the end of this whole thing, yells at him and says, hey, that's unacceptable. You're a king. You should carry yourself with more dignity than that. And he looks at her and says, I'm going to be more undignified than this. I was dancing for God. I can understand both perspectives. I can see why the wife is a little bit mad, but given David's reasons, I think we're supposed to side with him. And also it says that because she was so mean to David, God made her barren the rest of her life. So I think that we're supposed to definitely side with David here. But the idea is that David doesn't care, right? David does not care about his reputation. He does not care about how people perceive him. He simply wants to glorify God. David does not have he's a king not because he looks like a king and not because he acts like a king. He's a king because he has the heart of serving God's people, right? And because he has a heart for God. That's what makes David a good king. It's because he doesn't have what we naturally would expect, right? He doesn't have the chiseled features. Well, he's probably pretty. No, David, he's probably pretty muscular, but he doesn't have the qualities you would expect. Instead, the things that make him a good king is not his good-looking appearance or his muscular features. It's the fact that he wants to serve God and he wants to serve the people. That's it, right? He doesn't care if people respect him as a king. I don't care. I'll dance around in my underwear all I want as long as I'm praising God. That's just how he is. And as a result of that, we arrive at chapter 7. God sees what David's doing, and God approves big time. You remember with Saul, very quickly, God's like, hey, if you'd been obedient, I would have established you a kingdom forever. No. Well, with David, he was obedient. And so, chapter 7, one of the most, this chapter right here, the reason why I have it by itself, it is one of the single most significant chapters in the entire Bible. And that chapter right there is probably the reason why Samuel was written. 1st and 2nd Samuel. Probably for this one chapter. Basically, David is looking at all the things that God has done for him. He looks at his nation. he looks at his palace, and he sees the Ark of the Covenant sitting in a tent. And he says, God, you've built a home for me. Let me build a house for you. I want to build you a temple. Right? How can I dwell in a house while you're dwelling in a tent? And God says, David, I appreciate that. I really do. But no thank you. Instead, let me keep building a house for you. Not a physical house, but a family line. Right? He says to David, I'm going to make you a covenant. Your family will sit on the throne forever. And I will be as a father to your son. And I will take care of him. And he will reign forevermore. That's an unconditional covenant. Forever. And that establishes the idea that there is going to be this messianic figure who shows up from David who will reign eternally. Right? That starts right here. Right? If you're starting in Genesis, you're tracing the seed. Who's going to be the person to crush the serpent? Well, now we have an answer who he's coming from. Right? We're going to see that David, he's not going to be the dude crushing the serpent. The serpent's going to crush him really badly in a second. But somebody from his line is going to do it. And somebody from his line is going to reign eternally over the kingdom of God. That's what chapter 7 is about. Super important chapter. But then we move on. Chapters 8 through 10 bring us to the end of David's triumphs. And it's all about David's hesed. What happens here? First off, what's chapter 8 about? Just to summarize that really quickly.
What if like David's victories, like conquering the Philistines and other people, and like kind of establishing Israel?
Yeah. Basically, David's just going around conquering everything, and as a result, all the nations are coming and being subjected to him. Right? It looks like how the kingdom of God's supposed to look. Right? Whenever Saul was king, basically Israel started off big and then just got smaller and smaller. Whereas David, he's expanding their borders. And he's bringing in stuff. Like basically the economy is flourishing. And he's just doing a great job at being a king. And then, as a result of this, David, he's just so great. Right? He's not letting his power go to his head. Instead, in chapter 9, he realizes, you know what? God's given me a whole lot. And I remembered I made a covenant with my friend Jonathan decades ago. And we said that if something ever happened to the other person, we'd take care of their family. And so he calls a friend up and says, hey, is there somebody alive in Saul's household that I could show some hesed to, some loving kindness, some mercy? And they say, well, yeah, Jonathan had a crippled son named Mephibosheth. And he's just living in the outskirts. He's like an outcast because Saul's family's we don't talk about them anymore. And David says, bring Mephibosheth here. And so Mephibosheth, this crippled boy, comes in. And David invites him to sit at his table forever, right? For the rest of his life. They're like, we're going to be friends now. That's crazy, right? What an upgrade, right? You became one of the king's closest friends. That's cool. But that's not enough. Instead, David also remembers some other people he wants to show some hesed to. And so when you get to chapter 10, he says, you know what? I want to show some kindness to this one guy. I heard that his dad died. Let's go see what that's about. And so he sends some soldiers to go, this is a foreign king, right? He sends the soldiers to the foreign king to be like, hey, we heard about your dad. We're so sorry. And these people, they're like, oh, David, basically they don't realize that David's built different. And so they just assume that David's sending spies. And they just assume the worst because that's what any other king would do. But David's genuinely just trying to be kind. And so what they do is they dishonor David's men. And they shave their beards and they cut off their pants so that their butts can be seen. It's really embarrassing. Even by modern standards, you'd be like, that's terrible. And these guys have to walk back home. David hears about this and he's ticked off. And so what he does is he ends up just conquering some lands. And basically, even whenever people don't receive his hesed, and even whenever David isn't trying to conquer lands, he ends up still conquering lands and expanding his territory. And so basically, if you just stopped with chapters 1 through 10, this would be amazing. Right? David is the pinnacle of what we want from a godly king. But then, sadly, you get to chapter 11, and things take a turn for the worst. And when you get to chapter 11, it's almost like David is a totally different person. We're only summarizing it. It's making me sad. Okay. At the time, whenever all the kings would go off to war, typically David would be the one at the front lines. But this time, it seems like finally, at long last, his power's gone to his head. And he's probably reflecting on, man, I've fought a lot of battles. Maybe I can just treat myself. Maybe I've earned some rest. You know what, guys? I'm going to sit this season out. Y'all go off to battle. I'm going to hang out here at home. I think we do this a lot in our own lives, and usually that's the number one way to just fall into sin. You're just like, I've earned some free time, right? Be careful what you do with that free time. David goes for a walk on the rooftop. He looks down. He sees one really fine naked woman. And he's like, hubba hubba. Calls her on over. Despite the fact that she's married to one of his close friends and fellow warriors. Despite the fact that he's already got a bunch of wives. He sleeps with her. He gets her pregnant. He's got a problem now. The man after God's own heart isn't looking very godly. So what does he do? He confesses his sins. He repents and says, God, I'm so sorry. No, not quite. Instead, it seems like he realizes, oh crud, I'm supposed to be this godly king. I need to hide this. Nobody can know. Who's he acting like?
Saul.
He's acting like Saul, right? So what he does is he ends up ultimately, long story short, trying to conceal his sin, and then that ultimately leads to him having his friend killed. It's terrible, right? All because he wanted to satisfy his lust, all because he wanted a little bit of free time. And so, as a result, he ends up marrying this girl. Her name is Bathsheba. So he does at least try to make things right. Too little, too late. But then he never confesses anything. And time passes. And then eventually this other prophet named Nathan shows up and says, hey, king. So I had something that I just encountered that I wanted to just drop by you to figure out what you thought about it. So there's like this rich man and this poor man, and like the rich man had so many sheep, and the poor man only had one sheep, and he loved the sheep like a daughter. And, well, the rich man had a visitor come by, and he should have slaughtered one of his own sheep, but instead he stole the poor man's sheep to give to the visitor to eat. What do we do in that situation? And David's livid. He's like, well, the answer's obvious. I mean, like, that guy deserves to die. But like, what he needs to do is he needs to pay fourfold for what he's done. Like, that's unacceptable. Like, we don't do that in this kingdom. And then Nathan says, okay, that's what I thought you'd say. You're the man. And clicks in David's head. He's like, what have I done? And he realizes that he is the man, right? He did this, right? He is the rich man. God had given him so many things. And God would have given him more. But instead, he took from a man who had nothing. And he realizes, crud, I'm not the man I thought I was. Right? Whenever he was killing Goliath, he didn't see himself doing this. Right? Whenever he was sparing King Saul's life, he didn't see himself doing this. Whenever he was wanting to build a house for God, he didn't see himself doing this. And so as punishment for this action, God says, a sword's going to divide your household. Right? And David repents and God forgives him. Right? You're forgiven, you're good, you're clean. But all because you're forgiven doesn't mean you escape the consequences of your actions. Right? So his relationship with God is restored and he is fine. But there are consequences. And that leads us to chapters 13 through 18, which is David's house being divided. I'm going to try to summarize this just to get us through it kind of quicker. Just like the man had to pay fourfold in the story about the sheep, David's going to pay fourfold. Right? The son that he has with Bathsheba dies. But she has another son. His name is Solomon. We'll start talking about him next week. Right? So one son dies. And then you got this other son named Amnon, who is really attracted to his stepsister Tamar. And he rapes her. Well, another one of David's sons, Absalom, who is Tamar's brother, not stepbrother, just actual brother, right? He hears about this. And so what does he do? He kills Amnon. Okay. And so Amnon, now he's also dead. Right? There's two sons. And Absalom recognizes that his dad's not going to be happy about this. Even though really David never really punished Amnon, which is pretty messed up. And so you kind of see where Absalom's coming from a little bit. Once again, David, not a great father. Absalom flees, and he's in hiding for a while, right? And he's just like kind of dwelling off on his own thing. But then eventually Joab shows up and says, hey, David, you can't allow this to go on too long. Like, you need to bring Absalom back, because if not, it's going to be worse for you than before. And to be fair, Joab has a point here. Like, if David tolerates this, it's going to get out of hand. And so David says, okay, fine, Absalom, get back home. But David doesn't talk to him, right? So he goes through the motions of reconciliation, but doesn't actually interact with him, right? There's never a moment where he says, hey, son, let's talk this out and let's get over this. Instead, he says, you can move back to Jerusalem, but you cannot dwell in my house. And Absalom's... to be fair, Absalom did something horrible, right? They're both in the wrong here. But David is typically the type of guy who would initiate doing the better thing. But he doesn't here. Until, once again, it's too little too late. Because basically, Absalom, he says, hey, Joab, I thought you said me and my dad were going to be on good terms. What's up with that? And Joab doesn't respond to Absalom. So Absalom burns down Joab's field and says, do you get the message? Once again, Absalom not a great guy. And Joab says, David, fix this. And so finally, David says, Absalom, I'm so sorry. And they reconcile as far as David thinks. Absalom, he's got other plans. Absalom is bitter, right? And his dad took too long to fix this, even though really, he was at fault, right? David really should have really tried harder there. Absalom ends up staging a coup, right? To where he says, you know what, Dad, I'm going to go down to Hebron for a little bit, just for some other stuff, just a little vacation. And while he's in Hebron, he ends up having people come in and coronate him and establish him as the new king. And really, everybody seems to be confused because people know that David's getting a little bit older, and they don't know, is this actually, did David actually establish him, or, is he rebelling? They don't really know. People are really confused about it because Absalom's hired some people to come in and, march and, blow horns and act like this is, an official thing. So people are confused about it. But Absalom leads this huge rebellion, and as soon as David hears news of it, he doesn't want Jerusalem to break into civil war. And so rather than fighting, he just leaves. And he just trusts that God will be faithful and bring him back. And so we have multiple chapters of David descending through the Mount of Olives and going over onto the other side and escaping across the Jordan River, basically going into exile, right? Metaphorically, David is following in the footsteps of the people of Israel. Because of his own unfaithfulness, he's going into exile. And he crosses the Jordan River, literally reversing the direction of the Israelites coming in to conquer the land. He goes out while Absalom goes to sit on the throne in Jerusalem. But David's a crafty guy. He knows what he's doing. And so he leaves some moles in the area, right? And so he leaves some spies in there to check things out and to send him some news. And through that spy system, ultimately, Absalom's entire plan falls apart, right? To where ultimately, just to fast forward through all of this, there's this final battle where Absalom is chasing after all David's men, and David's men won't let David fight because they say, hey, David, if you get killed, Absalom gets everything. You are number one priority here. You need to stay alive. And so David makes one request. Don't kill my son. Right? Because David, you can see his regret. Right? He's I didn't get reconciled in time. I want one more chance. Right? He wants to see his son again to try. So he says, don't kill him. And Absalom he quickly loses the battle. And he's fleeing. And one thing about Absalom is, like Saul, he was known for his head. Right? Saul was a head taller than everybody. Absalom had this beautiful mane of hair. He would literally cut it every year, and it'd be 5 pounds of hair each year. Just luscious locks. Well, that came to bite him in the butt. Because as he was fleeing, his hair got caught in the branches of a tree. And his donkey escapes underneath it. Once again, it's kind of humorous. Right? There's always donkeys that are... funny stories with donkeys. The donkey escapes. Absalom is left dangling from the tree, caught up by the thing that he once found pride in. Right? Pride comes before the fall. And he's just hanging there, defenseless. And if the people had listened to David, they could have easily captured him and brought him home. But Joab shows up. Good old Joab. And if you remember, Absalom burned down Joab's field. And Joab, you don't mess with Joab. So Joab, he kills Absalom. But he has a bunch of other people stab him too, just so you can say, oh, I don't know who actually killed him, David. It wasn't me. So Joab ultimately puts an end to this, and David grieves. And so when you get to chapter 18, ultimately David learns about Absalom's death, and he's torn up over it. Which leads us into Joab versus David. This is where, it's funny, if you look at your Bibles, usually the heading will not say Joab versus David. It'll talk about Sheba's rebellion and stuff like that. And that's because I think that you can only appreciate what's really going on here if you understand the grander scope of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Right? Because there is another rebellion that happens during this time period. Right? There's a guy named Sheba. He leads rebellion. Ultimately, it doesn't really go anywhere. Basically, it's just a dude who's like, we're going to reestablish our own kingdom. And he goes and he's trying to amass everybody. And really nobody's, not that many people are following. It's kind of he's just running and he's like, we're starting a new kingdom. And they're like, you and who? And he turns around. There's nobody there. He's like, all right, they're around the corner. They're coming soon. Sheba, his rebellion isn't that big. What really you need to see in chapters 19 and 20 is that Joab, he seems to think that David's gotten old and that David doesn't know what to do anymore. And so he thinks that he's in charge, right? And so Joab really, in chapters 19 and 20, just to summarize it, Joab gets too big for his britches and he says, all right, I'm the head honcho now. I'm going to make the calls. And if David says anything other than me, go with what I say, right? You're going to hold on to that information because that's going to become relevant when we get to 1 Kings next week. When you get to the appendix, basically you get 6 closing epilogues. And there's kind of this parallel to where the first and the last one, they both have to deal with sins that were committed. The second and the second to last one both have to deal with David's mighty men and the things that they did. And then the 2 middle ones both have to deal with songs that David sung. Right? So the first song is a song of deliverance that David sang after he was delivered from Saul. And then the last song is actually David's final words. Not probably his final words before he died. We're going to see those in 1 Kings. But these are his final, probably public words. And it's a song basically saying how God will exalt the horn of his anointed one, his Messiah. Right? And the way that the whole book ends, just to close this out because we went way over, the way that 2 Samuel ends is with that final epilogue. And in the final epilogue, David commits a sin by he performs a census over the land, right? And there's different reasons why people think that was sinful and stuff like that. We don't have to get into that now because that's too much detail. Ultimately, it was wrong. And God punishes David for what he's done. But then what David does is he wants to make it up to God and he wants to offer a sacrifice. And so what he does is he purchases the threshing floor of this one guy, a Jebusite, right? Because if you remember, the Jebusites lived in Jerusalem whenever it was called Jebus. David conquered it. Well, this guy still lived there apparently. So I guess David had just, by his mercy and grace, allowed this guy to keep living here. And ironically, so David's palace is here on a city, we would call it Mount Zion, right? That's what this city is. And just slightly above is where this guy's threshing floor would be, right? And David goes and he purchases that threshing floor so that he can offer a sacrifice to God. And the reason why the book ends there is because that threshing floor is going to become the future place where the temple will sit. And so it ends, basically, if you just look at the beginning of 1 Samuel and the end, it begins and ends at the house of the Lord, right? 1 Samuel opens up with Hannah crying out to God for a son. And she's in the place where God dwells, and Eli's there. And then the book ends with a holy king purchasing a place for God to one day dwell. Right? And so it's a really beautiful portrait right there. You get to see how far the story has come, and everything that Hannah prophesied about came true. Right? God has exalted his anointed one. Right? He has taken the lowly and exalted them. I mean, think about David. He was a shepherd. That his parents didn't even think anything of him. Yet now he is literally the king over, like, he is literally the single most important human being on the face of the planet at this time period. The Messiah dwells in his loins, right? And so that's how the story ends. And next week, in a much shorter Bible study, we're going to start 1 Kings chapter 1, which picks up... Oh, also, sorry, I put this slide just because I really enjoy this whole AI thing with all the different things you can make, and this is just David throughout his life. Look, it's just a little montage of David throughout all of his years. It's not that necessary. What I was trying to get to is the next slide, because in 1 Kings chapter 1, we will talk about the anointing of King Solomon. And we are going to enter into that stuff. And it's going to be swell. Sound good?
Yeah, good.
Sorry it went so long, but what can you do? There's a lot to cover. Can one of y'all pray for us? Or does anybody have any like questions or something you want to say? I talked for that whole last part because I was trying to finish it up. Anybody have something y'all want to say? Everybody's like, no, we just want to go home. Right. Somebody pray for us. Please.
I'll do it.
All right.
Lord, we thank you so much for allowing us to gather here together, God. It's such a privilege for us to be able to openly study your word. And Lord, even though we might have went over time than what we usually go, God, we're so thankful that we even have 30 extra minutes to spend time with one another, to edify each other, and to be able to dive deeper into your word so that we can learn about the Creator who not only created us in your image, but everything that's around us, Lord. I pray that as we go on throughout the rest of our night and through the rest of our week, that we can meditate on the words that we learned today, and we can think about those things as we go throughout our days. Lord, we thank you for all that you are and all that you do for us. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.